Welcome aboard the Bedtime Express, where every journey leads to peaceful dreams. Now it's time to get ready to take part in an extraordinary adventure that will gently carry you into the most restful sleep. Before we begin, please subscribe to Bedtime Express for more magical bedtime stories, and write down in the comments from which part of the world you join us and what time is it now. If you enjoy traveling with us, come back when you wake up to give this video a like. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your breathing slow and deepen. Tonight, we're traveling back through time to join a young Venetian named Marco Polo on his legendary journey along the ancient Silk Road. Over the next 2 hours, you'll drift through golden deserts, cross snow-capped mountains, discover magnificent cities, and witness wonders that changed the world forever. You'll meet wise merchants, powerful emperors, and fellow travelers, all while the gentle rhythm of camel bells and the whisper of desert winds carry you deeper into peaceful sleep. So relax completely, let go of the day's worries, and allow Marco Polo's incredible adventure to become the backdrop for your own journey into dreams. Our story begins in the floating city of Venice, where adventure calls to a young man with stars in his eyes. All aboard the Bedtime Express. Next stop, the Silk Road. The journey of Marco Polo along the Silk Road. Close your eyes, dear listener, and let your mind drift back through the mists of time to an age when the world was vast and mysterious, when maps had empty spaces marked, "Here be dragons," and when a young man's curiosity could change the course of history forever. Our story begins in the floating city of Venice in the year 1271, when the Mediterranean waters lapped gently against ancient stone steps and merchant ships bobbed like sleeping swans in the harbor. The air was filled with the scent of salt and spices, the calls of seabirds, and the distant chiming of cathedral bells that marked the passage of peaceful hours. In a grand palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal lived a boy named Marco Polo. At 17 years old, Marco had eyes that sparkled with wonder and a heart that yearned for adventure. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffeo, were successful merchants who had already made one incredible journey to the distant lands of the East, where they had met the great Kublai Khan himself. As the golden sun set over Venice that fateful evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Marco sat by his window, listening to his father and uncle speak in hushed, excited tones about their planned return journey to the court of the Khan. The flickering candlelight danced across their weathered faces as they unrolled precious maps and counted gleaming coins. "This time," Niccolo said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a momentous decision, "we shall take young Marco with us. It is time he learned the ways of the world beyond our beautiful Venice. Marco's heart leaped like a dolphin breaching the waves. He had dreamed of this moment through countless starlit nights, imagining himself crossing vast deserts, climbing snow-capped mountains, and discovering cities more magnificent than any fairy tale. And so it was that on a crisp morning in 1271, when the mist hung low over the Venetian lagoon like a soft grey blanket, the three polo men set forth on their extraordinary adventure. Their ship creaked gently as it pulled away from the dock, and Marco watched his beloved Venice grow smaller and smaller until it was just a golden speck on the horizon. The Mediterranean Sea stretched before them like a vast blue mirror, reflecting the endless sky above. Marco stood at the ship's bow, breathing in the salt air and feeling the gentle spray of the waves against his face. Dolphins danced alongside their vessel, their sleek bodies cutting through the water with graceful ease, as if blessing their journey with good fortune. For days, they sailed past islands that rose from the sea like ancient castles, their shores lined with olive groves and vineyards that cascaded down rocky hillsides. At night, Marco would lie on the deck and gaze up at the stars, learning their names and patterns from the ship's wise old captain, who had sailed these waters for 40 years. "You see that bright star there, young master," the captain would say, pointing with a gnarled finger toward the heavens. "That's Polaris, the North Star. No matter how far you travel, she'll always guide you home." The ship made peaceful stops at various ports along the way. In Constantinople, that magnificent city where East meets West, Marco marveled at the great Hagia Sophia, its massive dome seeming to float like a dream against the sky. The markets buzzed with activity, filled with merchants selling silk scarves that shimmered like captured rainbows, and spices that filled the air with warm, exotic fragrances. The sounds of the Constantinople marketplace created a symphony of human voices speaking in dozens of languages. Greek merchants haggling over precious pearls, Armenian traders displaying their finest rugs, and Turkish spice sellers calling out the virtues of their saffron and cinnamon. Marco walked through these bustling streets like a dreamer, his senses overwhelmed by the richness of this crossroads between worlds. As they sailed further east, through the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea, the very air seemed to change, becoming charged with the promise of adventure. The water grew darker, more mysterious, and the coastlines took on an otherworldly beauty that made Marco feel as though he was sailing into the pages of an ancient legend. After weeks of gentle sailing, they reached the port of Trebizond, where the sea met the land and their real journey would begin. Here, they would leave behind the familiar embrace of water and venture onto the ancient pathways that connected east and west, the legendary Silk Road. Marco stood on the harbor's edge as the sun rose, painting the eastern mountains in shades of gold and purple. Before them stretched roads that had been traveled by countless merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers for over 1,000 years. These were the arteries through which the treasures of the East flowed to the West, precious silks that felt like liquid moonlight, spices that could transform the humblest meal into a feast, and gems that captured the very essence of starlight. They joined a caravana-long, peaceful procession of camels, horses, and fellow travelers from many lands. The caravan leader was a wise Persian man named Hassan, whose beard was white as fresh snow and whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 journeys. He knew every oasis, every safe path, and every story of the road. The Silk Road, Hassan told Marco as they began their trek into the mountains, is not just one road, young traveler. It is like a great tree with many branches, all leading to the same magnificent destination. Some paths wind through flower-filled valleys, others climb over peaks that touch the clouds. Each route has its own magic, its own treasures to reveal. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and crystal clear. Marco could see for miles, in every direction, rolling hills covered in wildflowers, ancient monasteries perched on impossible cliffs, and villages where time seemed to move as slowly as honey on a winter morning. The caravan moved with the gentle rhythm of centuries-old tradition. Each morning, Hassan would wake before dawn and offer prayers facing the east, his voice joining with the singing of birds as the sky lightened from deep purple to soft pink. The camels would stretch and yawn, their bells tinkling softly as they prepared for another day of patient walking. Marco learned to love the peaceful routine of caravan life. During the day, he would walk beside the camels, listening to the stories of fellow travelers, merchants from Baghdad, with tales of flying carpets, pilgrims from Jerusalem speaking of miraculous healings, and scholars from Cairo who could read the stars like books. After many peaceful days of mountain travel, they descended into the heart of Persia, a land of poetry and roses, where the very air seemed perfumed with jasmine and the sound of distant flutes carried on the evening breeze. The cities they passed were like jewels set in green oases, Isfahan, with its blue-tiled mosques that reflected the sky, and Shiraz with its gardens, where nightingales sang among the rose bushes. In the Persian markets, Marco discovered carpets woven with such intricate beauty that they seemed to tell stories of their own. Each thread was placed with loving care, creating patterns that danced before the eyes like frozen music. The carpet merchants would spread their finest pieces on the ground and invite travelers to sit and share tea while they explained the meaning of each design. Some told of ancient battles, others of wedding celebrations that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. the Persian people welcomed the travelers with warmth that rivaled the desert sun. In every village, they were invited to share meals of fragrant rice studded with jewel-bright pomegranate seeds, tender lamb seasoned with herbs that grew wild in the mountain meadows, and sweet pastries that melted on the tongue like honeyed dreams. One evening, as they camped beneath a sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to pluck like fruit, an old Persian poet joined their fire. His name was Rumi, and his words flowed like water over smooth stones, telling tales of love and wisdom that made the flames dance higher and the night air shimmer with magic. "Listen, young traveler," Rumi said to Marco, his voice soft as velvet in the darkness. "The road you travel is not just made of sand and stone. It is made of dreams and wonder, of the connections between all living souls. Every step you take changes you, and every person you meet becomes part of your story forever." Marco felt these words sink deep into his heart like seeds planted in fertile soil. He understood that he was not just traveling to distant lands, but journeying into himself, discovering parts of his soul he never knew existed. As they traveled deeper into Persia, the landscape transformed from lush valleys to endless expanses of golden sand. The desert stretched before them like a sea of light, its dunes shifting and changing with each breath of wind. At first, Marco found the vastness intimidating, but gradually he learned to love the desert's profound silence and the way it made every sound, the soft padding of camel feet, the gentle chiming of bells, the whispered conversations of his companions seem precious and clear. Their caravan followed the southern route through ancient Bactria, where crumbling monuments spoke of civilizations that had flourished and faded like flowers in the desert. Here, Alexander the Great had once walked, and the Buddha's teachings had first taken root in Central Asian soil. In the city of Balkh, known as the Mother of Cities, Marco wandered through bazaars where merchants sold goods from every corner of the known world. There were Chinese silks so fine they could be drawn through a ring, Indian spices that could cure any ailment, and Russian furs soft as cloud. The air hummed with dozens of languages, creating a symphony of human diversity that filled Marco's young heart with joy. The architecture of these ancient cities amazed Marco beyond words. Towering minarets reached toward heaven like prayers made of stone, their surfaces covered in tiles that caught and reflected light in patterns of incredible beauty. Courtyard gardens provided cool refuge from the desert heat, with fountains that sang gentle songs and fruit trees that offered shade and sweetness to weary travelers. In every city, Marco discovered libraries filled with scrolls and books written in scripts he could not read, but whose beauty spoke directly to his soul. Scholars with long beards and kind eyes would invite him to sit and learn, teaching him words in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Knowledge, one elderly librarian told him, is the only treasure that grows larger when it is shared. The young Venetian learned to appreciate the rhythm of life in these desert cities. The day began before sunrise, with the haunting call to prayer that echoed from minaret to minaret across the awakening town. As the sun climbed higher, the streets would fill with merchants setting up their stalls, children playing games with stones and sticks, and women in colorful robes carrying water jugs balanced gracefully on their heads. As winter approached, their caravan prepared for the most challenging part of their journey, crossing the Pamir Mountains, known to travelers as the roof of the world. These peaks rose so high they seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself, their snow-covered summits gleaming like diamonds in the thin, crystal-clear air. The mountain passes were narrow and treacherous, with paths carved into cliff sides that dropped away into misty valleys far below. But Hassan, their wise caravan leader, knew every twist and turn of the route. He had crossed these mountains dozens of times, and his steady presence calmed both men and animals as they made their careful way through the high places. Marco had never experienced cold like this. The air was so thin that every breath felt precious, and the silence was so complete it seemed to ring in his ears like a bell. But the beauty was beyond description. Valleys filled with snow that sparkled like crushed jewels, and mountains that changed color throughout the day, from purple in the dawn to gold at sunset. At night, they sheltered in caves or simple stone huts left by previous travelers. They would huddle around small fires, sharing stories and warm tea while the wind sang its lonely songs outside. Marco learned that the local people, hardy mountain dwellers with faces weathered by wind and sun, could survive in conditions that would defeat most lowland folks. One evening, an old mountain guide joined their shelter. His name was Tsering, and he had spent his entire life guiding caravans through these treacherous passes. As the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, he told Marco about the spirits of the mountains. "Every peak has its own soul," Tsering said, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the air. "They watch over travelers, but they demand respect. You must approach them with a humble heart and gratitude for their beauty. Those who try to conquer the mountains will find themselves conquered instead. But those who walk with reverence will be blessed with safe passage." Marco felt the truth of these words in his bones. The mountains were not obstacles to overcome, but ancient presences to honor. Each morning, he began offering silent thanks to the peaks around them, and he noticed that his steps felt lighter and his breathing came easier. After weeks of high-altitude travel, the caravan began its descent toward the oasis city of Kashgar, gateway to the mysterious lands of the East. As they came down from the mountain passes, the air grew warmer and thicker, and Marco felt as though he was waking from a dream of ice and stars into a world of warmth and abundant life. Kashgar appeared before them like a mirage, made real a city of earthen walls and towering watchtowers, surrounded by green fields where farmers tended crops of melons, grapes, and cotton. The contrast with the stark mountain landscape they had left behind was so dramatic that Marco gasped aloud with wonder. The city's bazaars were unlike anything Marco had ever imagined. Here, the ancient trade routes converged like rivers flowing together, bringing merchants and goods from every direction. There were traders from India carrying peacock feathers and precious stones, Chinese merchants with bolts of silk in colors that had no names, and Central Asian nomads offering the finest horses in the world. Marco spent days wandering through the covered markets, his senses overwhelmed by the richness of sights, sounds, and smells. He watched artisans at work, carpet weavers whose fingers moved like dancers, jewelers who could set precious stones so delicately they seemed to float in their settings, and metal workers who hammered silver into shapes of such beauty they took his breath away. In the evening, the city transformed into a place of enchantment. Oil lamps flickered in windows and doorways, casting warm golden light on the faces of people gathering in tea houses and courtyards. Musicians played instruments Marco had never seen before long, necked lutes that sang like birds, drums that spoke in the voices of distant thunder, and flutes that could make listeners weep with their beauty. The people of Kashgar welcomed the travelers with legendary hospitality. They were invited to feast after feast, where they sat on silk cushions and ate from plates of gold and silver. The food was a revelation: pilaf studded with lamb and raisins, vegetables cooked with spices that created flavors Marco had never dreamed possible, and sweets made with honey, nuts, and rose water that dissolved on the tongue like edible perfume. From Kashgar, their caravan turned eastward toward the most feared obstacle on the entire Silk Road, the Taklamakan Desert, known to the Chinese as the Desert of Death. This vast wasteland stretched for hundreds of miles, its shifting sands swallowing caravans whole, and its mirages leading travelers astray until they perished of thirst. But Hassan, their wise guide, knew the secret paths through this seemingly endless sea of sand. He had crossed the Taklamakan many times, following ancient routes marked not by roads or signposts, but by the position of stars, the direction of winds, and the locations of precious oases hidden like emeralds in the golden vastness. Before entering the desert, the caravan made careful preparations. They loaded extra water onto their strongest camels, checked and rechecked their supplies, and performed rituals to ensure the protection of the spirits that watched over desert travelers. Hassan gathered all the merchants and their servants in a circle and spoke words that carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "The desert will test us," he said, his voice steady and calm. It will show us mirages of cities that do not exist, whisper promises of water where there is none, and fill our ears with the voices of those who have perished in its embrace. But if we remain together, if we trust in our preparations and keep faith in our destination, the desert will also show us wonders beyond imagination. And so they entered the Taklamakan as the sun was setting, the sky above them painted in shades of orange and purple that reflected in the sand dunes like ripples on a golden sea. The silence was profound, deeper than the mountain silence Marco had experienced in the Pamirs, filled with an ancient presence that seemed to watch their small caravan with invisible eyes. By day, the heat was tremendous, forcing them to travel only in the early morning and late afternoon. During the blazing midday hours, they would rest in the shade of their camels or in simple shelters made from cloth, sipping warm tea and conserving their energy for the journey ahead. But it was at night that the Taklamakan revealed its true magic. As the sun disappeared and the temperature dropped dramatically, the desert filled with sounds that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The wind, blowing across the ridged surfaces of the dunes, created music-low, haunting notes that rose and fell like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Marco learned that these were the famous singing sands of the Taklamakan, a phenomenon that had inspired legends and poetry for centuries. The local guides told stories of how the music was created by the spirits of lost travelers still wandering the desert and calling to their loved ones. But Marco preferred to think of it as the desert's own song, a lullaby sung to soothe the fears of those brave enough to cross its vast expanse. The Middle Kingdom revealed. Every few days, their careful navigation would bring them to an oasis, a miracle of green life blooming in the heart of the wasteland. These oases were like dreams made real, with palm trees that provided cooling shade, springs of sweet water that bubbled up from deep in the earth, and small communities of people who had learned to thrive in the desert's embrace. Each oasis had its own character and charm. Some were tiny, consisting of no more than a few palm trees and a well, where they could rest for an hour and refill their water skins. Others were substantial communities with mud brick houses, bustling markets, and even small mosques, where the faithful gathered to offer thanks for the blessing of water in the wasteland. In the oasis of Hotan, famous throughout the known world for its jade and silk, Marco discovered artisans whose skills seemed touched by magic. The jade carvers could transform rough stones into objects of such delicate beauty they seemed to glow with inner light. The silk weavers worked with threads so fine they were almost invisible, creating fabrics that felt like captured moonbeams. The people of the oases had developed a culture uniquely their own, blending influences from every corner of Asia. Their music combined the rhythms of India with the melodies of Persia and the harmonies of China. Their food featured spices from the south, noodles from the east, and cooking techniques passed down through generations of desert dwellers. Marco was particularly enchanted by the children of the oases, who played games that required them to find hidden objects in the sand, navigate by the stars, and identify different types of wind by their sound. These were the skills that would allow them to survive and thrive in their desert homeland. But to Marco, they seemed like magical abilities. In one oasis, an elderly woman named Fatima took a special interest in Marco. She had spent her entire life in the desert and could read the landscape like a book written in sand and stone. She taught him to recognize the subtle signs that indicated the presence of underground water, to identify edible plants that grew in the desert, and to predict changes in weather by observing the behavior of birds and insects. "The desert is not empty, young traveler," Fatima told him as they sat in the shade of her date palm tree. "It is full of life for those who know how to see. Every grain of sand has a story, every gust of wind carries messages, and every star in the desert sky is a guide for those who learn to read their language." After more than a month in the Taklamakan Desert, the caravan finally reached the city of Dunhuang, home to the famous Jade Gatethi traditional entrance to China proper. As they crested the final sand dune and saw the green fields and earthen walls of the city spread before them, a great cheer went up from the tired travelers. They had successfully crossed one of the most dangerous stretches of the entire Silk Road. Dunhuang was a city of wonders that seemed to exist in a realm between dreams and reality. Here, Buddhist monks had carved hundreds of caves into the cliff faces, decorating them with paintings and sculptures of such beauty and spiritual power that merely looking at them brought peace to the soul. Marco spent hours wandering through these sacred caves, marveling at depictions of bodhisattvas with serene faces and flowing robes, and scenes from the Buddha's life painted in colors that seemed to glow with inner light. The monks of Dunhuang welcomed all travelers regardless of their faith, offering shelter, food, and healing to those who needed it. They had created a library containing thousands of scrolls and books written in dozens of languages, preserving the wisdom and knowledge of centuries for future generation. Marco was amazed to discover that some of these texts described lands and peoples unknown to European scholars, expanding his understanding of the world's true size and diversity. From Dunhuang, their route led eastward toward the heartland of China, following paths that brought them eventually to their first glimpse of the Great Wall. Nothing could have prepared Marco for this sight, a massive stone and earthen barrier stretching as far as the eye could see in both directions, snaking across hills and valleys like a great dragon made of stone. The wall was not just a fortification, but a statement of human determination and ingenuity that took Marco's breath away. He learned that it had been built over many centuries by millions of workers, each stone placed with care and dedication to create this monument to protection and perseverance. Standing atop one of its watchtowers, looking out over the vast Chinese landscape that stretched to the horizon, Marco felt truly humbled by the magnitude of human achievement. The guards at the wall checkpoints examined the caravan's documents with meticulous care, for China was a highly organized empire where every traveler's presence was recorded and monitored. But the Polo family carried letters from Kublai Khan himself, documents that opened every door and smoothed every difficulty. These papers were their passport to wonders beyond imagination. As they traveled deeper into China, Marco discovered a civilization of sophistication and refinement that surpassed even his wildest expectations. The cities were larger and more prosperous than anything in Europe, with wide boulevards, magnificent palaces, and markets that sold goods from every corner of the known world. The Chinese people had developed technologies that seemed almost magical to European eyes. They could make paper from wood pulp and plant fibers, creating writing material far superior to the expensive parchment used in the West. They had discovered how to make gunpowder, which they used not for warfare, but for spectacular fireworks displays that turned the night sky into a garden of colored stars. Most miraculous of all was their invention of printing. Marco watched in amazement as craftsmen carved wooden blocks with mirror images of text, inked them carefully, and pressed paper against them to create perfect copies of books and documents. This meant that knowledge could be preserved and shared far more easily than in Europe, where every book had to be copied laboriously by hand. The Chinese approach to medicine also fascinated the young Venetian. Instead of the crude methods used by European physicians, Chinese doctors had developed a sophisticated understanding of the human body's energy systems. They used tiny needles inserted at specific points to relieve pain and cure illness, a practice that seemed like magic but produced results that could not be denied. Agriculture in China was an art form that had been perfected over thousands of years. Marco marveled at the terraced hillsides where rice grew in perfectly maintained flooded fields, creating landscapes of geometric beauty that reflected the sky like mirrors. The farmers had learned to work in harmony with the natural rhythms of water and weather, producing abundant harvests that fed the empire's vast population. Chinese gardens were another revelation, representing a philosophy of harmony between human creativity and natural beauty. Every element was carefully placed to create scenes of perfect balance and tranquility, curved bridges over still ponds, pavilions positioned to frame views of distant mountains, and paths that wandered through groves of bamboo and flowering trees. Finally, After more than 3 years of travel, the Polo caravan reached Khan, the magnificent capital city where Kublai Khan held court. The city was larger than anything Marco had ever imagined possible, with a population of over 1 million people living in neighborhoods that stretched beyond the horizon. The Khan's palace was a complex of buildings so vast it formed a city within the city. Golden-roofed halls were surrounded by gardens where exotic animals roamed freely, and artificial lakes reflected the beauty of pagodas and pavilions. The walls were decorated with paintings and tapestries that told the history of the Mongol Empire, depicting battles, conquests, and ceremonies in colors so vivid they seemed to move with life of their own. When Marco was finally granted an audience with Kublai Khan, he found himself in the presence of one of the most powerful men who had ever lived. The Khan was not the savage barbarian that Europeans imagined, but a sophisticated ruler who had embraced the best of Chinese culture while maintaining the strength and mobility that had made the Mongols masters of half the world. Kublai Khan was immediately impressed by Marco's intelligence, curiosity, and gift for languages. The young Venetian had learned to speak Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and even some Chinese during his journey, and his keen observations about the lands and peoples he had encountered fascinated the emperor. "You have eyes that see truly and a mind that remembers everything," the Khan told Marco during one of their early conversations. "I have need of such a person to serve as my emissary to the far corners of my empire. Will you accept this honor and responsibility?" Marco's heart swelled with pride and excitement. To serve as an ambassador for the most powerful ruler in the world was an opportunity beyond his wildest dreams. He accepted eagerly, not knowing that this decision would lead to adventures that would make his journey along the Silk Road seem like mere preparation for the wonders to come. For the next 17 years, Marco Polo served Kublai Khan as diplomat, administrator, and explorer. The Khan sent him on missions to every corner of the vast Mongol Empire, from the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia to the frozen steppes of Siberia. Each journey brought new marvels and new understanding of the world's incredible diversity. Marco learned about the Khan's remarkable postal system, which could carry messages across the empire faster than anyone had thought possible. Relay stations were positioned exactly 1 day's hard ride apart, with fresh horses and riders always ready to carry imperial messages onward without delay. This network of communication allowed the Khan to govern territories that stretched from Korea to Hungary, maintaining contact with his governors and generals across distances that would have been impossible to manage in earlier times. During his travels for the Khan, Marco witnessed the incredible diversity of peoples and cultures that existed within the Mongol Empire. In the tropical kingdoms of Southeast Asia, he marveled at cities built on stilts over rivers and lakes, where merchants traveled by boat through floating markets filled with exotic fruits and flowers. The local people had learned to live in harmony with the monsoon rains and river floods, creating a civilization that flowed like water itself. In the northern provinces, Marco encountered nomadic tribes who followed vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep across endless grasslands. These people lived in portable felt tents called yurts, which could be assembled or dismantled in minutes, allowing them to move with their animals in search of fresh pasture. Their way of life had remained unchanged for thousands of years, and they possessed a deep understanding of weather patterns, animal behavior, and the subtle signs that indicated the health of the grasslands. The Khan's empire included peoples who worshipped in temples filled with golden Buddhas, others who prayed in mosques with soaring minarets, and still others who honored the spirits of mountains, rivers, and forests. Kublai Khan had wisely chosen to allow each group to maintain their own traditions and beliefs, understanding that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. Marco was particularly fascinated by the Khan's paper money system, which seemed like pure magic to someone raised in Europe, where all currency was made of gold and silver. The Chinese had discovered that pieces of paper, when backed by the emperor's authority and bearing his official seal, could be used for trade just as effectively as heavy metal coins. This innovation made commerce far more efficient and allowed merchants to carry vast fortunes without the burden of transporting chests full of precious metals. One of Marco's most extraordinary missions took him to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, where he sailed through seas of the most incredible blue-green color, dotted with islands that rose from the water like emerald jewels. The air was filled with the perfume of exotic flowers and the songs of birds with feathers of every color imaginable. On the island of Java, Marco discovered Hindu temples carved from black volcanic stone, their walls covered with intricate sculptures that told stories of gods and heroes in a visual language of breathtaking beauty. The local people had created a culture that blended Hindu and Buddhist traditions with indigenous beliefs, resulting in ceremonies and festivals of magnificent complexity and joy. The spice markets of these tropical islands were like glimpses into paradise. Here grew the precious cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon that European merchants would pay their weight in gold to obtain. Marco learned that these spices grew on trees that were tended with religious devotion, for the local people understood that their aromatic treasures were gifts from the gods that required proper respect and gratitude. In the kingdom of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, Marco witnessed the harvesting of precious gems from mountain streams and coastal deposits. Rubies red as pigeon's blood, sapphires blue as the deepest ocean, and emeralds green as new leaves were plucked from the earth like flowers from a garden. The gem cutters of Ceylon possessed skills passed down through countless generations, knowing exactly how to reveal the inner fire that lay hidden within each rough stone. The people of these southern lands had developed a profound understanding of astronomy and navigation. Their sailors could cross vast stretches of open ocean using only the stars, wind patterns, and the behavior of seabirds to guide them. Marco watched in amazement as these skilled navigators could predict the location of invisible islands days before they appeared on the horizon. Back in the Chinese heartland, Marco explored cities of such size and sophistication that they redefined his understanding of what human civilization could achieve. Hangzhou, which the Chinese called the most beautiful city in the world, was built around a lake of perfect tranquility, its shores lined with pagodas and gardens that created reflections of stunning beauty in the still water. The city's population of over 1 million people lived in harmony despite their vast numbers. Wide canals carried goods and people throughout the urban area, creating a network of waterways that made Hangzhou seem like a much larger version of Marco's beloved Venice. The sounds of the city were musical, rather than harsh. The gentle splash of oars, the melodic calls of street vendors, and the distant chiming of temple bells that marked the passage of peaceful hours. In Beijing, Marco marveled at the Forbidden City, where the emperor lived surrounded by courtyards and gardens of impossible perfection. Every building was positioned according to ancient principles of harmony and balance, creating a space where earthly power could commune with heavenly wisdom. The roofs were covered with tiles of golden yellow, the color reserved for imperial use, and they gleamed like captured sunlight against the blue sky. The Chinese had developed a cuisine of incredible refinement and variety. Marco learned to appreciate subtle flavors and artistic presentations that turned every meal into a celebration of the senses. Tea drinking had become a ceremony that promoted contemplation and friendship, with different varieties of leaves producing liquids that ranged from pale gold to deep amber, each with its own unique character and effect on the spirit. Chinese poetry and painting represented attempts to capture the essence of natural beauty in forms that could be preserved and shared. Marco watched artists create landscapes with just a few brushstrokes, suggesting entire mountain ranges and misty valleys with an economy of means that seemed almost supernatural. The poetry was equally subtle, using simple words to evoke complex emotions and universal truths. Wisdom of the East. During his long residence in China, Marco began to understand the philosophical principles that shaped Chinese civilization. The concept of harmony between opposing forces yin and yang explained how the Chinese could embrace contradictions and find balance in situations that would create conflict in other cultures. Confucian ideals of respect for elders, education, and social responsibility created a stable society where individuals understood their roles and obligations. Yet this structure was balanced by Taoist teachings that emphasized spontaneity, naturalness, and the importance of flowing with life's changes rather than fighting against them. Buddhist monasteries throughout the empire served as centers of learning and compassion, where monks devoted their lives to understanding the nature of suffering and the path to enlightenment. Marco found their meditation practices deeply moving, even though he remained faithful to his Christian beliefs. The sight of hundreds of monks chanting in unison, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to connect earth and heaven, filled him with a sense of peace that transcended religious boundaries. The Chinese understanding of medicine as the art of maintaining balance within the human body impressed Marco greatly. Rather than simply treating disease after it appeared, Chinese physicians worked to prevent illness by helping their patients maintain harmony between their physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. This holistic approach to health seemed far more sophisticated than the crude methods practiced in medieval Europe. Marco spent many years observing how the Chinese marked the passage of time through festivals and ceremonies that celebrated the natural cycle of seasons. Spring brought celebrations of renewal and rebirth, with entire cities participating in dragon dances and flower festivals that honored the return of life to the world. Summer festivals featured boat races on rivers and lakes, with teams of rowers propelling their craft to the rhythm of drums while spectators cheered from the shores. Lantern festivals filled the night air with hundreds of glowing lights, creating magical scenes where reality and dreams seemed to merge. Autumn brought harvest celebrations that gave thanks for the bounty of the earth. The Moon Festival was particularly beautiful, with families gathering to share special cakes and contemplate the full moon's reflection in still water. Poets would compose verses about the melancholy beauty of falling leaves and the wisdom that comes with the passage of time. Winter celebrations centered around the promise of spring's return, with ceremonies that honored ancestors and renewed family bonds. The New Year festival lasted for days, with fireworks that banished evil spirits and welcomed good fortune for the coming year. Every home was decorated with red banners bearing wishes for health, prosperity, and happiness. Through participating in these seasonal celebrations, Marco learned to see time not as a linear progression, but as an eternal cycle of death and rebirth, endings and beginnings. This understanding brought him a sense of peace and acceptance that would serve him well in the years to come. After 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, Marco began to feel the pull of his homeland. Venice seemed like a distant dream, but it was a dream that called to him with increasing urgency as he entered middle age. His father and uncle also longed to see their native city once more, to walk the familiar bridges and breathe the salt air of the Adriatic. The Khan was reluctant to let his valued ambassadors depart. They had served him faithfully and skillfully, and their knowledge of Western lands and customs made them irreplaceable. But eventually, duty called them homeward in the form of a mission to escort a Mongol princess to her wedding in Persia. The princess, whose name was Kokachin, was young and beautiful, with eyes that held depths of wisdom beyond her years. She had been chosen to marry the Khan of Persia as part of a diplomatic alliance, but the overland route to her new home had become dangerous due to political upheavals. The safest path would be by sea, through the waters of Southeast Asia and around the coast of India. Kublai Khan entrusted this precious cargo to the Polo family, knowing that their experience and diplomatic skills made them the ideal escorts for such an important mission. The parting was emotional, for the Khan had come to regard the Venetians almost as family members. He loaded them with gifts of silk, spices, and precious stones, and gave them letters of introduction that would ensure their safe passage through his vast empire. The journey home by sea was as adventurous as their original overland trek had been. Their fleet of 14 ships carried not only the princess and her entourage, but also hundreds of other passengers and tons of valuable cargo. The vessels were Chinese junks, sturdy ships with multiple sails that could weather the storms and currents of the tropical seas. They sailed first to the port of Zayton, where Marco marveled at the efficiency of Chinese maritime commerce. The harbor was filled with ships from every corner of Asia, their holds loaded with goods that represented the wealth of nations. Chinese shipbuilders had developed vessels of remarkable sophistication, with watertight compartments that could prevent sinking even if the hull was damaged. From China, they sailed south through the straits and islands of Southeast Asia, navigating by charts and compasses that represented centuries of accumulated navigational knowledge. The monsoon winds filled their sails and carried them swiftly across waters that changed color from deep blue to emerald green as they passed over coral reefs and shallow lagoons. In the port cities of Southeast Asia, Marco witnessed the incredible diversity of maritime trade. Merchants from India brought cotton cloth and precious stones. Arab traders offered frankincense and myrrh from Africa, and Chinese captains carried silk, porcelain, and tea to markets throughout the Indian Ocean. The sea voyage was not without its dangers. Tropical storms could arise with frightening suddenness, turning calm seas into raging mountains of water that tested the skill of even the most experienced sailors. Pirates lurked near busy shipping lanes, and disease could spread rapidly through the crowded ships. Of the 600 people who began the journey, only 18 survived to reach their destination. The Indian subcontinent revealed itself to Marco as a land of incredible contrasts and overwhelming abundance. The Malabar coast was lined with ports where the air was thick with the aroma of pepper, cardamom, and cinnamon. Local merchants had developed sophisticated systems for grading and packaging spices, understanding that their precious cargo could lose value if not properly handled. In the great port of Calicut, Marco observed the complex interactions between Hindu, Muslim, and Christian merchants who had learned to trade peacefully despite their religious differences. The local rulers maintained order through a system of commercial law that protected all traders equally, understanding that prosperity depended on trust and mutual respect. The wealth of India seemed almost beyond belief. Temple complexes were decorated with sculptures covered in gold leaf, and the local princes owned collections of gems that would have ransomed entire European kingdoms. Yet this material abundance was balanced by a spiritual sophistication that impressed Marco deeply. Indian mathematicians and astronomers had developed knowledge that surpassed anything known in Europe. They understood the concept of zero, which made complex calculations possible, and they had created accurate calendars based on precise observations of planetary movements. Their medical knowledge included surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations that seemed almost miraculous. The variety of Indian languages, customs, and regional cultures amazed Marco. Each province seemed like a separate kingdom with its own distinctive arts, foods, and traditions. Yet they were united by underlying philosophical concepts about the nature of reality, duty, and the soul's journey through multiple lifetimes. Continuing westward, their fleet reached the Persian Gulf, where they finally delivered Princess Kokachin to her new home. The wedding celebrations lasted for days, with ceremonies that blended Mongol, Persian, and Arab traditions into a magnificent spectacle of music, dancing, and feasting. The princess, who had become like a daughter to the Polo family during their long journey together, wept when they parted. She gave Marco a ring set with a ruby from the treasures of Kublai Khan, asking him to remember their travels together and the friendship that had grown between East and West. From Persia, the Polos made their way overland toward the Mediterranean, retracing some of the routes they had followed decades earlier. The world had changed during their long absence. New rulers had risen and fallen, cities had grown or declined, and the balance of power had shifted in ways both subtle and dramatic. In Baghdad, they found a city still magnificent, despite the political upheavals that had shaken the Islamic world. The House of Wisdom continued to preserve and translate the great works of ancient learning, and scholars from many lands still gathered to debate questions of philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. The desert crossing from Baghdad to the Syrian coast seemed almost easy after their experiences in the Taklamakan and the dangers of the sea voyage. They traveled with a small, fast-moving caravan that made good time across familiar terrain. At night, sitting around their campfires under the brilliant desert stars, they told stories of their adventures to fellow travelers who listened in wonder. The return and legacy. When they finally reached the port of Acre on the eastern Mediterranean coast, Marco felt as though he was awakening from a long and wonderful dream. The familiar sights and sounds of Mediterranean civilization, the olive groves, the wine shops, the churches with their tolling bells, seemed both strange and comforting after so many years in distant lands. They boarded a Venetian galley for the final leg of their journey, and Marco stood at the ship's rail watching the Syrian coastline fade into the distance. Behind them lay the vast continent of Asia, with all its marvels and mysteries. Ahead lay home, family, and the challenge of describing experiences that would seem impossible to those who had never traveled beyond the familiar boundaries of Europe. The Mediterranean crossing was peaceful, with favorable winds that filled their sails and carried them swiftly westward. Marco used this time to organize his thoughts and memories, understanding that he would need to tell his story carefully if he wanted people to believe the wonders he had witnessed. As they sailed past the Greek islands and into the Adriatic Sea, Marco felt his heart beginning to race with anticipation. 24 years had passed since he had left Venice as a young man full of dreams and curiosity. Now he was returning as a mature adult, his mind filled with experiences that had transformed his understanding of the world and his place in it. On a misty morning in 1295, the familiar silhouette of Venice appeared on the horizon like a vision from a half-remembered dream. The city's domes and towers rose from the lagoon exactly as Marco remembered them, yet they seemed smaller somehow, less magnificent than the palaces and temples he had seen in Kublai and Hangzhou. Their gondola glided through the familiar canals toward the Polo Palazzo, past bridges and buildings that held the memories of Marco's childhood. But when they arrived at their family home, they found it occupied by relatives who barely recognized these travel-worn strangers, claiming to be the long-lost Polo men. 24 years had changed them all. Their hair was gray, their faces weathered by sun and wind, and their manner of speaking had been influenced by years of using foreign languages. Even their clothing, though rich, was cut in Oriental styles that seemed exotic and strange to Venetian eyes. To prove their identity, the returned travelers performed a dramatic gesture that became legendary in Venice. They invited their relatives and friends to a great feast, appearing first in simple clothes that made them look like ordinary travelers. Then they retired and returned wearing magnificent robes of silk and brocade. Finally, they brought out their travel-worn garments and began ripping open the seams, revealing jewels and precious stones that had been sewn into the fabric for safekeeping. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and pearls cascaded onto the table like a waterfall of condensed starlight, their combined value representing a fortune beyond imagination. The assembled relatives gasped in amazement, finally convinced that these were indeed the Polo men, returned from their incredible journey to the court of the great Khan. Marco quickly became famous throughout Venice for his tales of Eastern wonders. At dinner parties and social gatherings, people would gather around him to hear stories of cities with millions of inhabitants, of palaces built entirely of gold and precious stones, and of technologies that seemed like magic to European minds. Some listeners believed every word hanging on his descriptions of paper money, coal that burned like wood, and postal systems that could carry messages across continents. Others were skeptical, thinking that Marco was exaggerating or inventing details to make his stories more entertaining. Behind his back, some Venetians began calling him Marco Milioni, suggesting that he dealt in millions of lies rather than millions of facts. But Marco continued to tell his stories with patience and consistency, understanding that truth has its own power and would eventually be recognized. He spoke of Kublai Khan's wisdom and generosity, of Chinese inventions that could revolutionize European life, and of the vast network of trade routes that connected all the civilized nations of the world. Gradually, other merchants and travelers began to confirm parts of Marco's accounts. Venetian traders who ventured into the Black Sea brought back reports of similar wonders, and diplomatic missions to Mongol territories returned with stories that corroborated Marco's descriptions. Slowly, Europe began to accept that the world was far larger and more complex than they had ever imagined. Marco might have remained simply a storyteller, his experiences preserved only in the memories of those who heard him speak, if not for a chance encounter that changed the course of literary history. During a sea battle between Venice and Genoa, Marco was captured and imprisoned in a Genoese jail. His cellmate was a writer named Rustichello, who had previously written romantic tales of knights and adventures. During the long hours of imprisonment, Marco began telling Rustichello his stories of the East, and the writer recognized that these tales were far more extraordinary than any fiction he had ever created. Working together, they began to organize Marco's memories into a coherent narrative. Rustichello had the literary skill to shape the material into compelling prose, while Marco provided the authentic details that gave the stories their power and credibility. They called their collaboration Il Milione, referring both to Marco's nickname and to the millions of wonders he had witnessed. The book began with Marco's departure from Venice and followed his journey step by step along the Silk Road. But it was more than just a travel narrative. It was a systematic description of the geography, customs, politics, and economics of the lands Marco had visited. For the first time, Europeans had access to accurate information about the vast civilizations that lay beyond their borders. When Marco was finally released from prison and returned to Venice, copies of the book began to circulate throughout Europe. Scholars, merchants, and adventurers read it eagerly, using its descriptions to plan their own journeys and to understand the possibilities for trade and diplomacy with Eastern nations. Marco Polo's book had an impact that extended far beyond his own lifetime. It planted seeds of curiosity and ambition in the minds of future explorers who would use his descriptions as inspiration for their own voyages of discovery. Christopher Columbus carried a copy of Marco Polo's book on his voyage to the Americas, hoping to reach the Spice Islands and golden cities that Marco had described. Though Columbus never realized that he had discovered a new continent rather than finding a western route to Asia, his voyages were inspired by Marco's accounts of Eastern wealth and wonder. Portuguese navigators used Marco's descriptions of the Indian Ocean spice trade to plan their expeditions around the African coast. Vasco da Gama carried detailed notes based on Marco's observations when he finally reached the ports of India and established direct European access to the treasures of the East. Even landlocked European kingdoms began to see themselves as part of a much larger world. Diplomatic missions were sent to establish contact with the successors of Kublai Khan, and trade agreements were negotiated that brought Eastern goods directly to European markets. The technologies that Marco had described, printing, gunpowder, paper money, and advanced navigation techniques, gradually made their way to Europe, transforming medieval society and laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. Ideas have a way of traveling even faster than merchants, and Marco's book became a conduit for the exchange of knowledge between civilizations. As Marco Polo grew old in his beloved Venice, he often stood at his window overlooking the Grand Canal, watching the merchant ships come and go as they had in his youth. But now he knew that these vessels were part of a vast network of trade and communication that connected Venice to cities he had walked through, to people he had known, and to wonders that still seemed like dreams even to him. Sometimes, in the evening light, he could almost see the great caravans moving across distant deserts, their bells ringing softly in the wind. He remembered the taste of tea served in porcelain cups, the sound of prayers echoing from minarets at dawn, and the sight of snow-covered mountains that seemed to touch the stars. On his deathbed, when friends asked if he had exaggerated any of the wonders he had described, Marco replied with words that have echoed through the centuries. "I have not told half of what I saw." Even after a lifetime of sharing his experiences, the marvels of the East remained too vast and too magnificent for any single book or story to contain. And so, dear listener, as our story comes to its peaceful end, remember that Marco Polo's greatest discovery was not any single treasure or wonder, but the understanding that our world is vast and beautiful beyond imagination. Every journey, whether across continents or simply across the street to meet a new neighbor, has the potential to expand our hearts and minds. The Silk Road that Marco traveled still exists, not as a physical path, but as a reminder that all human beings are connected by invisible threads of curiosity, courage, and wonder. Every time we reach out to learn about another culture, taste a new food, or simply listen to a story from far away, we follow in the footsteps of that young Venetian who dared to dream of dragons and discovered that reality is far more wonderful than any myth. Close your eyes now and let your dreams carry you along the ancient paths where caravans still travel in the realm of sleep. Listen for the distant bells of camels, the whisper of wind across singing sand dunes, and the voices of storytellers sharing tales of wonder beneath stars that shine the same way they did 700 years ago, when a young man named Marco Polo first set foot on the road that would change the world forever. Sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your own journeys, whether in sleep or waking, be filled with the same spirit of wonder and discovery that guided Marco Polo along the Silk Road to the court of Kublai Khan and back again to the floating city of Venice, where all stories begin and end with the gentle lapping of water against ancient stones.